Okay. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm Mike Abramowitz. I'm the president of Freedom House, and I'm delighted to help that you're joining us for the launch of Freedom of the Net 2022, Countering an Authoritarian Overhaul of the Internet. For those of you who don't know Freedom House, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works to advance democracy globally and protect fundamental freedoms for all peoples. We identify emerging threats to democracy and human rights, advocate for effective policies to counter those threats, and empower frontline activists to defend political rights and civil liberties. This is a proud day for Freedom House. This is the 12th consecutive year that we have published Freedom on the Net. And for the 12th consecutive year, we have assessed a deterioration in freedoms online, part of a much broader trend of global democratic decline. The global internet is more fragmented than it has ever been, so much so that the current era is often called the splinternet age. At home and around the world, governments are breaking apart the global internet, building digital walls aimed at censoring dissent and monitoring users. The internet's initial promise of connecting people to each other, to new ideas and opportunities, and creating egalitarian spaces for sharing, learning, and documentation is inherently threatening to authoritarian regimes. I'd go so far as to say that it terrifies them. And this is why repressive leaders have sought to divvy up the open internet into more easily controlled online spaces. And sadly, they are succeeding. A record-breaking number of governments are restricting what their citizens can access and share online, whether by blocking foreign websites, hoarding personal data, or increasing control over their country's technical infrastructure. Restrictions that impact billions of people. Here's an eye-popping stat for you. More than 3/4 of the world's internet users now live in countries where authorities punish people for free expression online. Perhaps it won't surprise you that China remains the world's most restricted digital environment. Russia was this year's biggest score decline, as internet freedom dropped to an all-time low following the Kremlin's illegal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And in Myanmar, the military junta has spent the past year and a half cementing a robust and punitive censorship regime. Zooming back out, all of these emerging technologies and shifting norms are contributing to democratic decline on a global scale, which is why countering digital repression is vital to the global struggle against authoritarian rule. In that vein, Freedom of the Net does not just call out the problem, it also includes a roadmap for how democratic leaders everywhere can strengthen their efforts to protect internet freedom. Freedom House reports include specific, actionable recommendations in the hope that those can help the people working on policy solutions to the emerging threats that we've identified. So those are the broad findings of the report and what they mean for democracy. What we're going to do now is I'm going to turn things over to Allie, our research director for technology and democracy at Freedom House, to dig into the findings more deeply. We'll then be joined by Adrian Shahbaz, our vice president for research and analysis, and Adrian will moderate a panel of experts about the findings of this year's reports. So with that, let me turn it over to Allie.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you everyone for joining us wherever you are in the world. Like Mike mentioned, my name is Allie Funk. I'm Freedom House's research director for technology and democracy, and I'm a co-author of this year's report. I'll start today by walking you through our methodology and our key findings. I'm going to then round out my presentation with our central theme about the impact of internet fragmentation, and I'll conclude with some of those recommendations. We'll then dive into the conversation. Before I start, I just want to take a moment to thank the people who make this report possible. Each year, we work with over 80 analysts and advisors from civil society, academia, the media, and other sectors to assess the state of internet freedom. This report, it would just not be possible without these incredible experts, and we're thankful for their guidance and partnership. And I also want to thank more broadly the internet freedom community, whose research, advocacy, and programmatic work has really been essential for freedom on the net and for the broader fight for human rights online. I want to thank my co-authors, Adrian, Shahbaz, and Keon Vestensen, the entire team at Freedom House, and finally our donors who have continually supported us and made this report a reality. If you want to see any of the folks that we work with, head on over to our website, freedomonthenet.org, where we list everybody in full. So internet freedom, what is it? It's the simple notion that the same rights we have offline should also be protected online. So our methodology assesses how easily people can access the internet, whether that internet is censored, and how fundamental rights such as free expression and privacy are restricted or protected. So fundamentally, we're looking at people's real world experiences online in a given country. We're not rating one government's performance or one tech platform's performance. We cover 70 countries, or 89% of the world's internet users. We wish we could cover the entire world, but we've selected these countries to really reflect diversity across geographies, regime types, and internet controls. And the coverage period for this report was June 2021 through May 2022. So we found that global internet freedom declined for the 12th consecutive year in 2022, signaling a continuing crisis for human rights in the digital age. So that means of the 70 countries we cover, 28 declined while 26 improved. The rest did not have an overall score change. The biggest declines were in Russia, Myanmar, Sudan, and Libya. And like Mike introed, in Russia, internet freedom, it reached an all-time low following the military's illegal and brazen invasion of Ukraine. The government dramatically intensified its efforts to suppress domestic dissent and accelerated the closure or exile of the country's remaining independent media outlets. Myanmar declined second worst in our index, only scoring better than China. Major social media platforms are blocked, and people only have access to 1,200 websites. Activists, journalists, ordinary users, they continue to be forcibly disappeared, detained, and tortured for their online activity. Another big finding of ours comes from Hungary. The status of internet freedom declined from free to partly free, which really mirrors a broader trajectory for the country's democracy that Freedom House research has discovered. So amid primary elections in 2021, in which voters were choosing who would oppose Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his ruling party, cyber attacks took independent news outlets offline and electronic voting systems. Unsurprisingly, I think for a lot of folks on the call, China remained worst of the worst. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have Iceland at the freest, followed by Estonia and Costa Rica, large improvements in Armenia, Gambia, and Zimbabwe. And then lastly, the US also ranked free, tying with Australia and France to be 9th in our index. We saw a marginal improvement in the score, but two major challenges in the US to human rights online are the continued lack of a comprehensive federal privacy law and the worsening of political disinformation and online harassment, which is especially aimed at election workers and officials ahead of midterms elections next month. So conducting research on this scale, it really gives us a snapshot of how human rights of users online have shifted over the 12 years of our project. So in 53 countries, people face legal repercussions for their online speech over the past year. That's more than 3/4 of the world's internet users who can be arrested for simply what they post online. One of the most egregious cases was a pro-democracy activist in Myanmar was executed after criticizing the coup online and being alleged of inciting unrest. Censorship is also deepening. So this year we found that websites hosting political, social, religious speech like independent news outlets or civil society organizations were blocked in 40 countries. And that's a record high since we started this report. In Belarus, for example, the government authorities blocked the websites of civil society groups throughout the coverage period. And this is part of a wholesale scale assault on the groups that included raids, arrests, and forced closures. 21 governments blocked social media platforms, while 14 shut off the internet altogether. And this censorship, it really ramps up around political crises like protests, elections, or times of conflict. So for example, Sudan, which had one of the biggest score changes this year, authorities shut off the internet and blocked social media platforms as people protested against a military coup last October. Now I'm going to turn to one of our central themes of this year's report. So the reason why someone in New York or can send a message to someone in New Delhi or Buenos Aires is because the internet, it's built on a decentralized infrastructure. So networks around the world, they speak a common language that allows them to talk to each other and allows us to connect in this call and event today. This serves as the basis of the global internet. So while the global internet has always been subjected to some degree of fracturing along national borders, we found this year that internet fragmentation is accelerating at a rapid pace. So this means that more governments than ever before are trying to break apart the global internet so they can create more controllable online spaces. And some governments are doing this so that they can create an online space where disinformation dominates, but independent media and critical commentary can be more easily censored. People then only have access to an internet that mirrors the interests of those in power. But other governments, particularly more democratic ones, are inadvertently breaking apart the global internet when they're trying to tackle disinformation, protect user data, or deter genuine cybercrime. But regardless of the intention, this trend has very serious consequences for human rights, particularly for folks who live under authoritarian regimes or in backsliding democracies. So here's what it means for the ordinary user. On a fragmented internet, people may not have access to the same messaging platforms that their family members or members of a diaspora community do who live abroad. This means that it's harder for them to communicate with each other. It's also more challenging to build global solidarity and seek accountability if people can't share documentation of human rights abuses during protests or times of conflict to audiences around the world. And if you live in a country where the state manicures the media environment, internet fragmentation means you have limited access to reliable global information that could empower you to make more informed choices about those in power. So we identified 3 main causes of fragmentation in this report, occurring in countries across the democratic spectrum. First, we found that authorities in over 2/3 of countries covered by our report shut down the internet, blocked websites, or imposed new onerous regulations to censor online content from sources based abroad. So if you look at Cuba on our map, the internet was shut off, foreign news websites remained blocked, and international communication platforms were restricted during widespread protests last July. And the censorship limited Cubans' abilities to connect with the diaspora population who were really supportive of the movement. Second, more governments are passing legislation that limits the flow of user data across borders. The most concerning laws claim to protect privacy, but they do the opposite. They force data to be stored locally where it's more accessible to state actors. So if you look at Rwanda, a new data protection law mandates personal data to be stored in country. So what's the harm of this? Well, in Rwanda, it's particularly concerning because authorities have prosecuted dissidents based on their private messages. Finally, a small number of countries are trying to disconnect from the global internet altogether, centralizing their control over internet architecture compared to the network's broad. This has daunting economic and societal costs, and that's why it's only the world's most authoritarian regimes who have attempted to disconnect on the technical level. So how do all 3 of these forms of internet fragmentation play out? If we look at the protests that have swept Iran over the past month, we can see. So the Iranian government's really centralized control over infrastructure, it's forced companies to store people's personal data on local servers, and it's imposed broad censorship on foreign content. During the current protests, they've ramped this up. They blocked Instagram, which was one of the only remaining platforms that was still available, and they've also shut down the internet. This has limited people's ability to share stories of police violence to those abroad and undermined their ability to access independent foreign media. So the internet fragmentation that I've been talking about at a national level, it's part of this global battle to control the internet that mirrors broader geopolitical tensions. So in international forums like the United Nations, authoritarian powers led by China and Russia have made inroads. And this is particularly true at a UN agency known as the International Telecommunications Union, or the ITU. Authoritarians are trying to transform this body into a global internet regulator that advances their interests. They're also trying to convince so-called swing states of internet freedom, so Brazil or India, on the merits of the authoritarian model of digital control. And convincing these swing states to adopt this model could have long-term effects on the future of human rights online. But over the past year, coalition democracies have really pushed back against these efforts. So there's been these new initiatives such as the Summit for Democracy or the Declaration for the Future of the Internet. And the Declaration, for folks who might not know, it's a non-binding political agreement among over 60 governments that lays out a positive vision for the internet. However, democracy's progress on the international stage remains hampered by problematic internet freedom practices in their own countries. So of the 35 Freedom on the Net countries that participated in the Summit for Democracy, 13 experienced an internet freedom decline over the past year. So by adopting flawed policies at home, democracies risk undermining the very values they seek to defend abroad. So our report, we make clear that, despite all this bad news, the global internet, we still think it's worth fighting for. It's fostered connections and common interest among different communities, facilitated more transparent and participatory governance, and brought tremendous direct and indirect economic benefits. Giving up on the pursuit of internet freedom would mean leaving behind millions of people who live in the most authoritarian countries, and we just can't do that. Internet fragmentation also, it does little good at addressing these online harms that we're talking about, such as disinformation and harassment. So instead, we're calling for democratic leaders to recommit to preserving the benefits of a free and open internet, and then focusing more on developing societal resilience to the challenges the internet exacerbates, rather than just walling themselves off. So here's how we think we can get there. At home, laws requiring transparency can shed light on how platforms operate, and then this information can inform future policies about how to respond to disinformation. We also need more robust privacy frameworks and better safeguards against state surveillance. These laws should protect users by ensuring strong encryption standards and be created in coordination with other like-minded governments so that data can still flow across borders. And on the international stage, democracies should engage more robustly in multilateral institutions like the UN. So one example is that the United States government will take the chair of the 2023 chair of the Freedom Online Coalition. For those who don't know, the Freedom Online Coalition, it's this multilateral body of 34 member states that was set up to protect internet freedom. So as the 2023 chair, we're calling for the US government to lean in and has an opportunity to raise the forum's name recognition and its ability to really drive this diplomatic coordination that we're calling for. You can go to the next slide, please. So I want to end on a positive note, so we're not all just thinking everything's wrong. So despite the global decline in internet freedom that Mike and I have been talking about, we also found that 26 countries had an improvement in their internet freedom score. And that's a record high since the inception of our report. So what this means is that, over the past years, civil society, tech companies, and democratic governments have put a lot of effort and a lot of money in protecting internet freedom. And we're finally starting to see the results. So at the center of this progress is always civil society. Nonprofit organizations, media groups, human rights defenders, they take charge of first identifying a problem and then creating a strategy to address it. So if you zoom in, we found that at least 28 countries, courts protected internet freedom. Often, judiciaries overturned restrictive censorship or surveillance laws, often after strategic litigation cases that civil society brought. And courts have been the most effective at protecting human rights online in countries where they have space to act independently. And then in at least 30 countries, we found that tech companies protected internet users. Civil society has successfully advocated to companies to improve their policies and resist government demands for censorship and access to user data. And then finally, policymakers and regulatory bodies have protected internet freedom in at least 26 countries of the 70 that we cover. And in many cases, they've worked really closely with civil society and the private sector to craft bills that strengthen free expression and access to information. And one of my favorite examples of this work comes from Armenia. So this year, domestic and international civil society groups, they rallied against a criminal defamation clause that was used to prosecute people who had criticized the country's prime minister online. So civil society, they aired their concerns in private meetings with diplomats, and then those diplomats went to the Armenian government. And Armenian news outlets highlighted the law and its impact to the broader public. And these concerns were then cited in a formal appeal to the Constitutional Court. All of this action led the government to reverse course. Officials agreed to exclude this provision from the new criminal code, and they committed to broad consultation when developing media-related laws in the future. This is a clear win for free expression in the digital age. So all of this drives the final key recommendation that I want to end with. Governments in the private sector should more robustly invest in civil society. They need resources to train judges to understand complex digital issues so that we can bring strategic litigation cases that overturn problematic policies. More resources are also needed so civil society can advocate at the United Nations or to work in tandem with companies so the private sector can understand the different contexts in which they operate. There's clearly that more work needs to be done, but collectively we think that democratic policymakers, the private sector, civil society can strengthen resilience in the digital age and bring about a more democratic future. So I'll close there. I'll pass it off to Adrian Shahbaz to lead us into a conversation. But thank you everyone for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Allie, for the wonderful, clear, and powerful presentation. I'm Adrian Shahbaz, Vice President of Research at Freedom House. Freedom on the Net is near and dear to my heart. I've been part of this report every year since joining Freedom House in 2013. And I'm incredibly proud, not just of this particular edition of Freedom on the Net, but of our whole tech and democracy team, which has grown in size, scope, and ambition these past few years. And I'm honored today to moderate today's discussion with a fantastic set of panelists. Let me introduce them now. We have, I'll start with the ambassador. And just so that everybody's aware, in 2017, Denmark became the first country to formally create a diplomatic post to represent its interests before the tech industry. And for the past 2 years, the post has been held by our first panelist, Ambassador Anne-Marie Engtoft Larsen. Prior to her appointment as Tech Ambassador of Denmark, she led the World Economic Forum's work on the fourth industrial revolution and global public goods. She also co-founded an incubator for student entrepreneurship and co-founded Democratic Capital, a network focused on enhancing responsible and environmentally sustainable investment. We also have Gbenga Sesan, who's the Executive Director of Paradigm Initiative, a Pan-African social enterprise working on digital inclusion and digital rights through its offices in Cameroon, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University. We have Alexandria Walden, who is Global Head of Human Rights at Google, where she is responsible for coordinating and driving the company-wide human rights strategy, using approaches grounded in business and human rights. Alex worked on various human rights issues in her time with the Raven Group, the Center for American Progress, and in government. And of course, we'll welcome back Allie Funk, who leads Freedom House's Technology and Democracy Initiative, which includes Freedom on the Net, Election Watch for the Digital Age, and work related to protecting a free and open internet. So let me start by asking a few questions of our panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions from the attendees. You can all submit these using the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll get to this in the second half of our panel. So let me start with our really illustrious set of panelists that we have here. Really excited for the conversation today. Perhaps we can just ground this, set the stage here around why all of this is so important. And why, I'll start with the question to the ambassador. Why do you believe it's important to resist the further fragmentation of the internet? From your perspective, what are the benefits and risks of the open internet? I'll start with you, Ambassador, before opening it up to the wider panel.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues around the world. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And a special thank you to Freedom House, not only for the invitation, but for your incredibly important work in research, something that we in the Danish tech diplomacy use, I want to say, almost at a daily basis. I think ultimately, right now, we are at the moment in time where all the promises of the free and open internet, all the dreams that the visionaries 30, 40 years had about what an open internet could do, what it could be. It would be a place of incredible knowledge, of curiosity, of global engagement, of communicating regardless of what language you normally speak. You could engage and communicate directly with billions of people around the world. It's this idea of a technology that ultimately gives voice to the voiceless. Regardless of how many money you have, where you're placed, it is the idea of an internet that gave agency, that empower individuals not only to change their fate online, but offline as well. It's the internet that can give rise to democracy and take down authoritarian states and dictators. It's one that can create unprecedented solidarity because now we not only see it on a screen, but we engage directly with the people who might be far away from where we are. And all of these dreams and hopes, I still believe, are very much core to the idea and opportunities of the internet. But we also have to realize now it was not a self-fulfilling prophecy. It did not necessarily go that way. And unfortunately, every year your report underscores it. And though it is great to read, I think the end of it with the optimistic hope that still is an online world in decline when it comes to democracy and human rights. And it mirrors a world that you said yourself, it's an offline world, but it's also one where democracy is challenged. We see democracies on the decline, and the values that so many people fought so hard for in the 20th century are still not given in the 21st century. So ultimately, and that brings me to the question of what benefits does the open internet bring? So many, and I think they're so worth fighting for, that in this 21st century, it is not a matter of living with a fragmented internet. I think it is a matter of continuing to fight for an open, free, interoperable, secure internet. It is one where we also have to look at what does the internet look like. It is not necessarily created by small decentralized players all around the world, but we have some really big, what we in the European Union call gatekeepers, and the collaboration between democratic states, the gatekeepers that now make up a large part of the internet. We actually have an opportunity for moving the needle on some of these issues, and then working with civil society who are at the front line, both when the internet is shut down, but also in harnessing the opportunities of the internet. I don't think there are very much, when it comes to the risk of the open internet, I don't think there are many. I think the benefits by far outweigh the risks that are imposed in this. We see people right now in Iran, women, the only thing they have, it is immense courage and a Twitter account or an Instagram account fighting not only for the individual choices, but for the future of their state and their country and their government. And we got to make sure that technology continues to be a tool for emancipation, a tool for freedom, a tool for democracy. And that's why I'm looking forward to this conversation today, and how do we make sure to keep the internet as open and free, interoperable and secure as possible, addressing whatever risks might be there, but don't lose hope and faith in the ultimate mission of the internet.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Well, I think you've covered so much in your answer, which is really clear and powerful. I want to turn to Gbenga. Perhaps, from your perspective on this question about why is it important to resist further fragmentation of the internet?
Thanks, Adrian. So about 24 years ago, I was an engineering student in the university. And one of the key things that I always had in mind was, when we design solutions to problems, it's very frustrating when you find people then turning the solution on its head and trying to break it up. And I can imagine that for many people, the internet, was designed as a way of bringing the world together. Communication. Someone in Argentina who wants to speak to someone in Zimbabwe, you don't have to write letters. I used to write, have pen pals and write letters forever. But now you can send an email, to Alex, and she replies in a second. And so that's one of the, that's a major advantage. And that is the purpose of the internet. It's called the internet because it's an internet connected network of networks. So balkanizing that and breaking that up, it's literally breaking up our shared humanity. It's like saying you want to break up the skies. We share the skies as an open space above our heads, and there is no sense in saying that you want to break that up so that there's a segment for the US, a segment for Nigeria. And I think even beyond that, if there's any time in human history when we need to communicate more, when we need to share across borders, it's now. One of the lessons learned from the COVID lockdowns is that many people thought it was okay for you to do your thing on your own and you get by. But we've since learned that our shared humanity is stronger, is much, more needed, is more required than we ever envisaged. If there's anything we've learned from the lockdowns, that's one of the things, we've learned from that. And guess what? There are so many lessons. We have a lot of socioeconomic problems across the world. There are many, there's a huge on what the things that people are doing to improve scenarios across the world, and how better can you do that than to have an interconnected world. Unfortunately, the one reason why people want to break things up and create splinter nets all over the place is more often than not because you don't want to share good practices across. You want your own bad practice to be hidden away and tucked away, in a corner. Just as we have the open skies above our heads, I think the internet strongly represents an internet, not a splinter net, represents our shared humanity. And there's any time when we should experience that a lot more. It is now. There's a lot we can learn from each other as we emerge from that happened, during the COVID lockdowns, the economic opportunities that we need to see again, for people to learn good practices from each other.
Thank you so much, Gbenga. I mean, that's a great point on the common humanity and the lessons learned from the lockdown as well. Maybe turn to Alex from your perspective on this question about why it's important to resist further fragmentation.
Sure. Also, thanks for inviting us to participate in the conversation today. I think, for a few reasons. I think from a technical perspective, we worry that pivoting too strongly away from a global approach will undermine, the core protocols and networking standards that maintain interconnection. From a human rights perspective, we're worried about the cleaving of the world into binary camps of autocracies and democracies. And that will just really leave too many countries in the middle and inadvertently reinforce some of these sort of sovereignty narratives that really lead to tightening of national visions around the internet, as opposed to kind of the free and open internet vision we've long had. As the ambassador said, we've sort of the initial visions for internet freedom from the 90s and early 2000s, folks developing these visions had the tools themselves and were sometimes operating from a utopian mindset. And I think they didn't necessarily ask the hard questions or have the foresight to account for all of the potential ways in which technology might be misused. So now, the future is here, and we've developed greater awareness around all of the ways that we need to be thinking about how to prevent these potential harms. But also, as everyone else alluded to, we can really see kind of the incredible potential that a free and open internet can have for everything from economies to health and kind of connections around information sharing around health issues, for the environment, and obviously communities and communication writ large. So I think we remain optimistic also.
Well, we're with you on the optimism there. And I think that's a strong point on the differences and sort of the lessons learned from the 90s until now. And just that the policy conversations that we're having today, perhaps the research that we've had hasn't changed that much, but I think certainly the policy conversations have changed. Let me turn to you, Allie. This is in the report, but I want to hear your perspective on this question about the benefits and the risks of the open internet.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adrian. And everybody had such fantastic answers. I think there's just, two things I would chime in on. Is first, just imagine the sort of everyday consequences of a fragmented internet. I mean, we wouldn't be able to have this call because not everybody would have access to Zoom, because Zoom would only be able to operate where, regulatory it made sense for them to do based on the requirements, or, where they chose. So I think the everyday life impact of a fragmented internet, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around what that would look like. Because also, if you think about internet speeds, right? A fragmented internet really slows down how we can connect. And I think if anybody deals with that, challenges with bandwidth, it's can be super frustrating. So I think just, everyday life would be undermined. But the other point that I would touch is connect to this broader, just democratic decline that Freedom House has been tracking. I think we've had 16 years of decline in just broader democracy and fundamental freedoms. And on a fragmented internet, repression is just easier to get away with because you can suppress sort of, documentation of human rights abuses. You can limit people's ability to connect with, the international community, and you can limit people's ability to really build this transnational solidarity around protest movements, which is really important for them to be successful or to bring about policy change. So a lot of that would just be upended. So you would have not just undermining of internet freedom in our everyday lives, but just broader democracy and the increase of just authoritarianism that we've been tracking.
It's a really great point, Allie, and I think really sets the stage. The impact is almost too big to have an understanding about. It's like, what would this actually mean? And certainly, yeah, we couldn't be having this discussion today. Let me go to the ambassador now for a question just for you, Ambassador Larsen. So the Danish government launched the Tech for Democracy pledge this year. This was a really interesting initiative. Freedom House was a part of this. We were very proud to be a part of it. I wondered if you could just share a little bit more about the pledge and its goals, given the impact that this pledge has had, how many people have signed up. Would love to just hear the Danish government's perspective about what is Tech for Democracy.
Absolutely. Well, the Tech for Democracy pledge, we're very delighted, now has 150 signatories on it. And that's everything from large to small countries, the biggest to somewhat smaller tech companies and civil society organizations, UN organizations from around the world. And while I think, the road to almost everywhere is paved with principles and pledges and documents, so, why yet another one? Most importantly for us, this was to say there is a lot of really important work that's been on election integrity. There's a lot of work around sort of specific technologies and human rights. What we aim to do with this is less than a document and more of an intention of saying between elections, what happens those years between elections where we find that that's where democracy is declining online too. It's not only around these sort of high profile events where I think we've become significantly better as democracies, as coalitions, as tech companies in pursuing sort of integrity and upholding the principles of the internet. But what happens in between when we as citizens and institutions slowly are seeing eroding trust in our institutions, in democracy, where the sort of agency that individuals have are solely eroding because then one, social media is turned off even just for a few days, and the internet is not really available, or we see sort of slow but increasingly gathering of data that can ultimately be used against their own citizens. So Tech for Democracy is an attempt to say, let's focus on not only those sort of high profile events, but what happens to our societies, democracies, and communities on a daily basis. That's one. Secondly, it's the purpose with this one was to gather companies and civil society and governments around the table in the recognition that neither of us can solve this alone. And I think there's a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives that are incredibly wonderful and that we are part of and we're proud to be part of. And I think we're going to be also discussing the Freedom Online Coalition later. We needed to also show what can we do in the short to medium term of this. So the Copenhagen Pledge have led to now 12 action coalitions, and they are focused on everything from access to trustworthy information, algorithmic transparency, sort of tackling gender-based harassment and violence online, how to get more civil society engaged in the UN processes there via video conferences. And all of this have actually shown sort of a 12-month sprint for most of these action coalitions has been, let's sit around the table. What solutions can you put on? What changes can you do either in your behavior and operations as a business? What can you as a government do in terms of using diplomatic pressure on individual states in the EU and the UN, transatlantically, where it might be? So we wanted to show with this pledge that this is something that we can do in the short term, that the multi-stakeholder approach, it does work. It might be messy, but it is the only way to tackle. We can't regulate us out of this immediately tomorrow. And then finally, I've been really heartened to see how many of the signatories have also made individual commitments. Part of signing up and the small accountability mechanism there is in this is that whether it be companies or civil society or government saying, look, we are also making our own contribution and commitments to this. And we're going to change a small thing in what we're doing now. And those are the ones I think that shows me the most that there is a momentum here where we're realizing if we don't preserve democracy, if we don't fight for democratic values and ideals right now, we are not only going to lose them, but we're slowly sort of sowing over the branch upon which we're sitting. And all the wonders and opportunities that technology and particularly the internet gave us will not be the same going forward.
It's such the pledge and really meets the moment, I think, in a lot of the conversations that we're having now. And it's so great to see not only the really strong principles, but the emphasis on what is going to be the action and implementation that comes from this, and seeing already the results from that is so promising to see. I wanted to bring in Gbenga here on sort of the civil society angle, given the amazing work that Paradigm does. My question is, as governments are racing to catch up with rapid technology developments, how can civil society and concerned citizens encourage their governments to account for human rights principles and to enshrine them in future regulations?
So I think the first thing, of course, is to make sure that, as citizens or civil society, that we understand the issues. And this is the part where I'm the first to admit that there are too many issues. There's so many issues, from time to time. Today you're talking about laws, tomorrow you're talking about encryption, and all that. And I think this is where it matters that concerned citizens are able to focus on the areas that they either understand the most or that impact their work the most, or the areas of interest the most. And that's really important, because it's unfortunate when there are so many issues that are thrown at you. And I think there are governments, by the way, there's a trend that we've seen in the report of many African countries that we do every year in terms of digital rights and inclusion. We've seen that governments that deliberately throw some issues up because they know that there's so much limit. There's limits to what civil society and citizens can handle over time. They throw up issues deliberately sort of distract from one issue that they're trying to work on. But apart from understanding the issues, it's also what is also important is working together to literally break the silos. This is when Ambassador Larsen was speaking earlier. One of the things that I find interesting, about people making the pledge, this process, is that it is not seen as a one group answers all questions process, because you cannot have that scenario where only government or only civil society or only the private sector, only the academia, are able to answer questions. That where we've seen the need to work together. I mean, there are groups that we've had conversations with. Some of the most interesting are the judiciary. When we go to court and we get response judges in early cases, I think in 2013, we were called, one of the judges said that, why are you so interested in surveillance by government? And then Court Paradigm Initiative, he called us busybodies. And it was interesting, but that was a limited knowledge at the time. But now we have a chance to sit around the table, across the table, with judges, and to train them on digital rights issues. And it's a very interesting conversation to have. And I remember, last year, that I had a chance to was the anniversary of the day that the government of Nigeria through the military killed young protesters. And it was a tense conversation to have with judges. But the fact that we were all touching different sides of the elephant, we were able to have a more robust and a well-rounded conversation. So I think we need to work together. We've also had a chance to train security agencies. And it's interesting. I mean, I've had in a room people who literally arrested me and having a conversation with me now about digital rights. And for them, for the first time, to understand that the reason why they need to talk about rights is because if they don't create a level playing field where everyone's rights are respected, then when they leave government, when they leave their position, they will also, in quotes, benefit from the dangerous trend that they've set. Something that individuals and civil society organizations must also do is to follow the process. And I can imagine it's quite stressful at times to follow the entire process, but we have to follow the process, because if we don't follow the process, these conversations of this, rapid developments like governments, you may not be able to know speaking up is important. The timing of speaking up also matters. If you're speaking up about a dangerous law, M7 or surveying, assign it into law instead of speaking up before, while there's still a conversation of it being a bill, then there isn't as much impact you can have as if you have spoken up, a lot earlier. But apart from that, two quick things I want to mention. One is we must begin to test the laws a lot more. And when I say this, I speak not only for citizens and also companies. In countries where, on the internet, there should be an opportunity to test the laws and to see if the court can at least pronounce something that is fair and not immediately, comply with everything. And lastly, we must begin to propose solutions. In 2014, we put together a draft and freedom bill in Nigeria, which thankfully is now being discussed in at least 5 African countries. I wonder who's going to pass it into law first. But the idea was we were responding to a question. The question was, you don't want us to do this. You don't want us to break, violate rights and all that. What exactly do you want? And our response was, what we want is documented in this body of work called the Digital Rights and Freedom Bill. I think we need to begin to propose solutions, because in many cases, what I've learned over the last 15 plus years is that many governments that are doing things that we're questioning, honestly, could use some suggestions on how better to do it. But of course, if you propose it, you should be willing not to take the credit all the time. Because what we have learned is, if you want to propose this and take the credit, I'm not sure there's any government that wants to admit, we messed up and you fixed it and you take the credit. We've had scenarios where we've had to propose the solutions and they've had to look good, but guess what? It's fine because everyone benefits.
That's so it sounds like follow the process, test the laws, propose solutions. The work that Paradigm and so many other digital rights organizations is doing is so important. Training and the role of civil society, I think, just in terms of creating a more rights respecting environment is fundamental, I think, to this conversation that we're having. I'm going to turn to Alex. You had talked earlier about the sort of dichotomy of authoritarian countries and democracies. And obviously, I think the war in Russia is a good example of that. And also some of the complications of then making sure to protect users in both democracies and authoritarian countries. That's a very challenging position to be in. I wondered if you could share about Google's approach to protecting users in Russia and Ukraine. And I'm thinking also about some of the either the longstanding or pressures that you face from the Russian government, and what's been your approach to make sure that that you're protecting human rights online.
Sure. So maybe I'll start by just giving a little bit of context for how we approach human rights at Google writ large, because I think it's important to sort of see what it looks like when a company, especially a large company, sort of takes it seriously. So for Google, our commitments to human rights are grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its implementing treaties, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and then also in the multi-stakeholder principles from the Global Network Initiative. So those are really sort of the core documents and standards that we look to inform our global approach. What's also important is that for us as a company, our approach is sort of structural. Our commitment to human rights is integrated into our governance structure, our due diligence and risk management, and our operational practices. In everything we do, so from launching new products and to like expanding operations around the globe, we're guided by these international standards related to human rights and humanitarian law. So this commitment obviously underpins our approach in Russia and Ukraine as well. So maybe I'll just highlight sort of a few areas that we've focused on across our platforms. The first is related to preventing disinformation. The second is about continuing to provide authoritative information across our services, including in Russia. The third is about promoting digital security. And then last, it's really about providing humanitarian assistance and support to the region more broadly. All of those things kind of taken together are how we're thinking about, what it is that is our responsibility under the UN guiding principles and how that really manifests across the products and services that we offer in the region. As an information company, we obviously take our responsibility seriously to provide reliable and trustworthy information to people when they need it. So we saw, for example, how many Ukrainians turn to search to find up-to-date information, including where to find shelter or humanitarian aid. Or we did things like launch air raid alerts for people on their phone. Another example is that we also, to help, we rolled out new features to enhance access to trusted information, like info panels in local language and transparency labels for publishers on YouTube. So we really have thought about, in this context, what are the ways in which our products can be helpful? And then also, what are the ways they might be misused, and ensuring that we're protecting against that. Obviously, a big part of the challenge is addressing misinformation that was spreading about the realities of the facts on the ground. So in addition to our ongoing global work in the area, we committed $10 million to the effort to kind of fund and support new partnerships with think tanks and civil society in the region to ensure that we were supporting research, region-specific research on misinformation and disinformation, and then also grants for fact-checking in the region. And last, maybe I'll just highlight my colleagues over at Jigsaw, a sort of unit within Google, have done tremendous work to build technology to counter threats to open society writ large. And so they have been partnering with local experts and academics to develop and inform their approaches to sort of directly counter disinformation and help people more easily identify it. So our global approach is really focused on embedding human rights throughout our approach to information integrity and content responsibility. And it's deployed here in this sort of region as well. Maybe I'll just highlight, specific to Russia, what we've seen in Russia, but also note that it's really not specific to Russia, and your report kind of calls this out, is that we've seen regulations that provide for penalties and criminal liability for employees. And that's an especially troubling trend for us. And it impacts our ability to kind of ensure that we can implement a nuanced and tailored approach to content moderation in every country and globally. So maybe I'll just highlight that as one of the things that we've seen there, but again, not specific. We've seen that elsewhere around the world too.
That's a great overview, Alex. Thank you for that. And I just did, on a personal note, I remember seeing some of these tools in place, right? Like and seeing a lot of journalists, human rights activists, and others actually relying on these tools to keep safe. So it's great that they're rolled out. And I'll make a plug for last year's report, Freedom on the Net 2021, which looked at this issue of government regulation to control big tech, often at the expense of users' rights. There's a fantastic report for any of you audience members interested in that. Let me turn to the Q&A, because we have a lot of really interesting questions here that I want to make sure our panelists get the opportunity to answer. There are a few different questions from Victoria, Ernesto, Swati about tech diplomacy, let's say. Some specific questions about the ITU and whether it's the Cuban government, the Russian or Chinese governments. What are their intentions at the ITU? Is it to exploit procedural rules to obstruct discussions, or is it about making substantive changes to the discussion, to the way that the internet actually works? And I want to open it up to some of the multi-stakeholder initiatives that many of our panelists are a strong part of, whether that's the Freedom Online Coalition or the Internet Governance Forum. And I'm wondering, maybe to expand it on this question of diplomacy and multi-stakeholder action, how can democratic government, civil society, and the business community work together to ensure that our efforts to keep the internet free are coordinated and don't inadvertently fragment the internet further. Maybe I'll come to Allie first on this question, and then I'll just open it up to the panelists.
Fantastic set of questions. I think this is a really interesting space, especially just the last year. I've seen so many new initiatives like the ambassador mentioned. Let me start with the ITU, and then I'll talk a little bit about the FOC and then pass it off to my fellow panelists who I'm sure have really interesting insights. So the ITU is interesting in that, over the past recent while, there was, a Chinese diplomat who was Secretary General of the ITU, and what he tried to do under his tenure, and not just him, but more broadly, some of the authoritarian powers who are part of the ITU, was really make the regulator have increased power so it can set technical standards. And this might sound a little wonky, but it's actually really, really important and foundational to how the internet functions. Because right now there's a host of different bodies around the world, like ICANN, and a lot of these are multi-stakeholder. So their civil society plays a role, the technical experts, the private sector, the folks who run the cloud, all these different folks play a role in setting the standards. And that's how it's been. And that's allowed for this really decentralized structure that has been able to work across countries. And what authoritarian powers have tried to do is move that decision-making about those technical standards into the ITU, where governments have more power over what to say rather than the experts, the technical experts. So, an example was Huawei, the Chinese telecom provider, brought this proposal called the IP proposal to the ITU that would have totally upended the interoperability of the internet. And it got voted down, thank goodness, but it's since popped up in other forums. So they're trying to do a little bit of both here. They're actually trying to use the existing procedures to push their interests, but also to change what's happening. And I would, a really great win, I would say, for internet freedom is that the US candidate who ran against the Russian candidate for the ITU Secretary General just won last month. And she's the first woman to run the agency, but she also has pledged to promote a free and open internet. So I think that's a really fantastic thing. Touching just quickly sort of on the FOC, there's also the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, the Copenhagen Pledge that the ambassador talked about. I view these initiatives, a lot of them, they're not binding, they're not an international law, but what I think they do is they're norm setting. So they allow a bunch of governments or actors in the Copenhagen Pledge, since that one's multi-stakeholder, to come together and say, these are what we care about, this is our vision. And then once you sign on to that, it then allows you in multilateral or just bilateral engagement with diplomats for one government to go to the other government and say, hey, you shut down the internet. Yeah, that doesn't abide by the Copenhagen Pledge you signed on to or the declaration. And you can use that as a sort of compelling way to have those conversations, which I think is really important. And what we sort of, one finding in the report that I didn't get to go into in my presentation was around internet shutdowns and how the work of, democratic governments and civil society and the private sector over the past years to say, internet shutdowns are not justified, how that sort of multi-stakeholder advocacy is actually starting to have a change. So, it's particularly, I'll give a shout out to Access Now, who runs a coalition called the Keep It On Coalition. It's over 200 organizations around the world. And they do, before an election, like Gbenga was mentioning about timing, before an election, they'll go to telcos or to the government and say, please don't shut down the internet. Here's why it would be a bad decision. And that's made tangible change. So that advocacy effort has created norms globally, at the G7, the Freedom Online Coalition, to create a norm around against internet shutdowns. Last point, and then I'll pass it on. And the Freedom Online Coalition. I think this is a really interesting space. It was set up to protect internet freedom specifically. The US has talked about expanding the coalition. Right now it's only 34 governments. And one of the things Freedom House is calling for is some sort of accountability mechanism within the existing government. So there's a way to assess, our member states living up to the values, increasing staffing of the FOC so it can do this diplomatic engagement. So we're excited to see where the US government takes it. And Freedom House is a member of the advocacy or the coalition body there, advisory council. So we'll hopefully play a key role in pushing that through.
Thanks so much, Allie. I wonder if I can turn to the ambassador on this question, particularly of tech diplomacy. Obviously, Denmark's a pioneer here. Want to hear your thoughts about what does it take these days to make sure that we're promoting a free and open internet through diplomacy, through multi-stakeholder bodies. And then maybe I'll turn to Gbenga too to talk about the IGF piece as well.
Absolutely. Well, not surprisingly, I think tech diplomacy is incredibly important, and I just want to, a few reasons why. One is, as I said before, we have democratic governments. We have a huge sort of catch up to do when it comes to regulating this space. For a long time, it's sort of been the Wild West, 30 years of, relatively unregulated. And now we're at the point where I think, we've been catching up and saying we didn't do enough to sort of set the basic frameworks for human rights, privacy, antitrust, et cetera. But we also recognize that we are not in a place where everything tomorrow will be perfectly regulated and we can look into a free and open internet. And at the same time, the sort of regular diplomatic engagement we have with other countries or multilateral organizations alone can't fix this. This requires engagement, dialogue, collaboration, critical but also constructive diplomacy with the tech industry. And that is, in a nutshell, what tech diplomacy is. It is finding common ground where possible. It is advocating much more strongly for the engagement between the tech sector and government. And I think we have seen a dramatic shift in that over the past couple of years, from the sort of move fast and break things and don't really engage with government 5-10 years ago to a I think Alex's role is such a good example of it. Large tech companies are, I think, admittingly understanding the need to engage with the tech and with government. Secondly, they've also, willingly or unwillingly become geopolitical actors, whether it is their platforms that are being shut down amidst a conflict or a crisis. We've seen the war in Ukraine has really, propelled the understanding that technology platforms are not neutral. They are part of hybrid war. And in the engagement with them, the world becomes a little bit more black and white on some of these issues. There is, how do you support democratic forces? You can't just, I think, have a sort of a naive idea that you can stay neutral in that space. And then I think an important thing to recognize here, it's very great that, everywhere I go now, we talk about the ITU, which is incredible. We should have done that 10 years ago. And we haven't. I think now we're sort of coming to the fore that it's not only a group of wonderful technical nerds setting the standards for technology, but it is setting the rules of the road for how our technologies are functioning and what values those standards are set with. And now we're recognizing it and moving to the fore. Another thing that's quite sort of on my mind is these different coalitions and multi-stakeholder groups and international organizations that we're part of. Why is it that Freedom House report every year shows that there is a consistent decline? I mean, we really try to come together, but we have not done enough. And so maybe there's maybe not to be the negative one. I think there's a question to us here is, how do we make sure that 2 or 4 years from now, the Freedom House report does not show the same picture? What is it that we need to do more? And I think there's going to come a question of what is the teeth? What is the accountability? How do we make sure that this becomes more than good intentions? And at some point, I think there might be a trade-off in some of the decisions that we're making. And I recognize that some of the laws and regulations at times do have a secondary negative effect. When we see the German NetzGG, I think, which with good intentions and purposes in Germany was used in the Philippines as a sort of a blueprint for something where government could decide what to take up and take down. We got to figure out better ways to do this. And I think we also got to figure out a way to not constantly have these conversations about how to keep the internet free and open, while right now, frankly, we're losing a little bit of that battle.
That's a great point on the need for solutions, and also understanding how what democracies do influences what other governments are doing, and sort of provides that blueprint. And NetzGG, I think, is a good example of that. Gbenga, is there something, I know you've done a lot of work on the IGF. I just wanted to bring you in here perhaps really quickly before turning into some of the other questions that we have, just to share some of your own personal reflections on on what it takes to protect human rights online, some of the work that you're doing on multi-stakeholder level.
Thanks, Adrian. I mean, it's interesting that I've just joined the leadership panel on the IGF at a very, very, very interesting time. But I think a few things that are there for me that we can benefit from the IGF process include, number one, to stop treating this as events, but as platforms for engagement. And I know that people say, the conversations we have there are not, binding and things like that. But if they are seen as platforms for engagement and we do engage, then that means we don't treat them as this. I speak more to countries that sort of, wait until September before they start thinking, oh, we're going to the IGF in November. But, because there are so many processes. There are national processes. Ideally, national processes should feed into regional processes that should then feed into the global IGF. But apart from that, we need to start having more transparent and open conversations on these platforms. I know many times countries want to be diplomatic, but what I've said to the leaders we have conversations with is that diplomacy doesn't mean deception. If someone is doing something silly or something stupid, it's not like rubbing their ego and making them feel you're not doing anything wrong. You can tell people that this doesn't work and also let them know that you're struggling with the same thing. Some of it needs to be eliminated from the conversations we have. If you know that in your own country, as a country that supports, digital rights and freedom of expression and all that, if there are challenges you have, there's no reason people have engaging this and that institution instead of making it look like A or B or more often than not good or bad. We need to have those those conversations, and these platforms like the IGF provide an opportunity to do that. So we need to definitely realize that diplomacy doesn't always mean deception, and we must have more frank conversations.
Thanks so much, Gbenga. I want to turn to, we have 7 minutes left. I want to get to some of the other great questions that we have here. Perhaps starting with Alex, you can reflect on the previous question as well. But I just want to get these questions out there. There's a question from Michael about encryption and how this has been a hotly debated issue for 30 plus years, which is shows just, how some of these issues just don't go away, right? The question that Michael has is, which countries are doing the right thing to promote the use of encryption to protect privacy and freedom of expression? Are any of them, is I think the main question. There's also a question here that I might combine from Christophe and also from Jalil about how do we combat disinformation and misinformation? What's a realistic solution to tackle this issue, especially when it has the ability to influence large communities of people? Jalil points more towards, the Chinese government or the Russian governments using propaganda as a tool to spread their own rhetoric, defend their own brutal policies. What are the best practices for preventing disinformation and propaganda spread by authoritarian states like China, and how can we hold them accountable? So a lot of questions there. Feel free to maybe just take one part of that, but I think on the encryption side and or on the countering mis and disinformation side, we'd love to hear, Alex, your perspective first, and then I'll open it up to the panel to close this out.
Maybe I'll take a slight crack at a few of them. So I think, when it comes to encryption, Google has had a long-standing commitment to privacy writ large, and then end-to-end encryption as part of the panoply of things that are important to the universe of users that we're engaging with. So I'm not sure that there's a particular government that I want to call out, but I do think maybe what I will do is pivot to kind of talking again about the importance of multi-stakeholderism, and kind of picking up on some of what Gbenga, Allie, and the ambassador were saying. From our perspective, there really is collaboration between governments and private sector and NGOs are key. And the sort of path forward really requires us to recognize the legitimate local interests while maintaining global alignment. And so really, we see such a critical role for governments to commit to intergovernmental regulatory dialogue to ensure that new rules that govern the digital realm strengthen our shared values. And so that applies obviously to many of the freedom of expression related topics we've discussed, as well as privacy related ones. On disinformation, maybe I'll highlight a big picture thing and then a few more granular things. I think in the same way that we approach information integrity writ large is the same way we should start with our approach to misinformation and disinformation. So for us, our approach is called the 4 R's. So that is remove, reduce, raise, and reward. And so that's really kind of being clear that there's not a single way companies or platforms should approach moderating content. It needs to look different depending on the platform or service and the way users and the public are interacting with it. And so sometimes that's about removing content when it is illegal or when it violates our policies. Sometimes that's about reducing the kind of visibility of content that is borderline or doesn't have sort of the indicators of authoritativeness or credibility. And that's also about raising and rewarding authoritative content and supporting the journalism and news ecosystem, along with many other credible sources. And so that sort of as a holistic approach is what's the most kind of important way to address this issue. And then I think it's really important to have teams like we do. Our TAG group at Google is the one who is, tasked with investigating and tamping down on attacks, sort of coordinated attacks against our systems and to violate our policies. And so it's important for companies to really be taking kind of the cybersecurity threat seriously and making sure we're protecting both our services and infrastructure more broadly.
It's great points. I think, it's hard to pick a winner on encryption. Allie, you've been on the encryption beat for a long time. I'm just curious to hear, we have 3 minutes left, maybe just in a minute or two, this question from Michael on encryption.
I love to say that I'm on the encryption beat. How fun. Yeah, I wish there were governments where I'm like, they're doing it right. I mean, but I don't think there are. I think one of the things that we've tracked is how democratic governments themselves, especially through like the Five Eyes agreement, have disparaged end-to-end encryption, and then how that then fuels more authoritarian proposals to undermine encryption, and the pointing back to democracies. Well, if they're doing it, we can do it. So I don't think it's a bright view. And there's been sort of newer trends in how they're trying to undermine encryption. One is traceability provisions keep popping up in new internet regulation laws, which just requires companies to be able to identify the first sender of a message. In order to do that, you have to undermine encryption. We've also seen some new laws pop up, I think in Germany is one, where it's sort of legalizing basically a form of malware that allows, police to bypass encryption by just going into a phone. So I don't know if there's good stories there, but I'll pivot and say one of the areas around surveillance, there is a lot of movement and there might be ways to lessons learned from is around spyware. There's like past year, tons of new initiatives, export control initiatives, out of the US, UK, EU, Canada that have been, they've been leading on how to roll back sort of the proliferation of Pegasus from NSO Group. And then, Costa Rica was the first and only government to call a moratorium on the use of the technology, which is actually a really big deal. So I think there's probably some lessons learned there about what civil society has been doing. The private sector's done a lot of work on, limiting spyware that maybe we can apply to the encryption conversation.
That's a great point. Thank you, Allie. We have 1 minute left. I wonder if I can just do 30 seconds from the ambassador and from Gbenga just on final reflections. This report is a snapshot of time, examination of internet freedom for 2022. What's your sense of internet freedom's trajectory going forward? Maybe just in 30 seconds, Ambassador and Gbenga.
I was born an optimist, so the conversations that we've been having today and the more than 200, 300 people that have been tuning in, the work that we're all doing is sort of remaining on the side of hope and optimism. That being said, I think this is a time to recognize that the the game is somewhat rigged. And right now, the authoritarians are also setting the rules for how we should be playing it. And to the question around mis and disinformation, I think we keep playing it on a really nice side of things. And meanwhile, Russia Today hires 300 journalists in Nairobi to produce effectively anti-Western narratives about the war in Ukraine, inflation, food insecurities. So let's figure out also setting, not only playing, but setting the rules of the world forward. But so, cautious hope and optimism.
I like that. Gbenga, final thoughts from you?
Bad actors are going to keep doing bad things, but then it's up to us to, create a balance of forces that could at some point be greater than, that thing about escape velocity. At that point where you generate enough energy to escape from the force of gravity. And I think that's what we need to do. Civil society, businesses, governments that believe in rights, we need to work strongly together because bad actors will continue. The question is, are we serious enough to, generate greater energy than what they come with?
Hard to end on a better call to action and a great invigorating comment. I want to thank everybody for attending this presentation and panel today. I want to give a special thanks to our wonderful panelists for a great conversation. Please go to freedomhouse.org, check out the reports, a lot of interesting country reports, data, graphics, recommendations there for everybody to read and hopefully use. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.